This is BBC One. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Peter Sissons and Laurie Mayer.
Terrorists threaten Britain and Pakistan as the Kashmir crisis deepens. India's Prime Minister tells his troops it's time for a decisive fight. Another suicide bombing in Israel, 3 dead, many hurt. A report calls for radical changes to drugs policy, but ministers stay wary. And another England player crocked. Now 1 in 4 has a problem.
Here in the southeast, a Brighton priest is missing in Liberia. It's feared he's been captured by rebels. And protest in Brussels. Rail bosses from Britain demand better security on the French side of the Channel Tunnel.
Good evening. British nationals in Pakistan were given a stark warning today that they're now targets for Islamic terrorists. Half our diplomats there are being pulled out, and thousands of British visitors are being advised to leave. And tension is spreading across the region as the conflict between Pakistan and India over the disputed area of Kashmir escalates. Tony Blair described it as very serious and grave. India's Prime Minister openly threatens war. Pakistan says that will be met by full force. Both nations are nuclear powers.
In Kashmir, the emotional climate could hardly be more explosive. The funeral is for a local Kashmiri leader regarded by both sides as a moderate in the lethal dispute over this territory. Whoever murdered Abdul Ghani Lone, from the Indian or Pakistani side, it was almost certainly to provoke more violence, to push towards war. And India's Prime Minister too is talking up the prospects of war. Atal Bihari Vajpayee told his frontline troops ranged against Pakistan to prepare. Let's work for victory, he said. It is time for a decisive battle. We will write a new chapter of victory. His enemy, Pakistan's President Musharraf, did renew a pledge to crack down on militants striking Indian targets. But then he vowed to use full force if India attacks. Up to 1 million soldiers are now at the front line, and both sides have nuclear weapons. In London, Tony Blair was blunt about the risks.
It cannot be stressed enough the dangers inherent in this situation, where India and Pakistan are presently confronting each other. And I do urge both countries and the leadership of both countries to pause and reflect before taking action that could plunge not just their countries into conflict, but the wider region, with implications for the whole of the world.
As if to underline the turmoil, Britain is pulling half its diplomats out of Pakistan. The High Commission in Islamabad will become even more of a fortress. Not because war may loom, but in response to direct threats of Islamic terrorism. A series of recent bombings has killed French and American citizens. In the past few days, extremists have apparently switched their attention to potential British targets.
We've had specific threats against our posts in Lahore and Karachi, which led to their temporary closure. And then on top of those very specific threats, there's also been a range of intelligence. Added all together, I've made the decisions I've made.
There's no direct connection between the risk of war involving 2 nuclear powers and the threat to British people in Pakistan. The Foreign Office and Downing Street are keen to emphasise that. But there are common threads. There's hugely increased tension throughout the region. That can create a climate which encourages extremism and terrorism. James Robbins, BBC News at the Foreign Office.
And Susanna Price is in Islamabad and joins us now. Susanna, does the Pakistan government share Britain's concern about this terrorist threat?
Well, yes, Pakistan is extremely worried about the terrorist threat. It's had a history of sectarian and ethnic violence, but since the beginning of the year, there's been this dramatic increase in attacks on foreigners. We've had the murder of the American journalist Daniel Pearl and this attack in Karachi, which left 11 French nationals dead. And what was particularly worrying about that was that it appears it was a suicide bombing, which is virtually unprecedented here in Pakistan. The government has almost admitted that really it doesn't know how to prevent such attacks, and it doesn't actually know who is behind them.
So how tight a grip does Musharraf have on the numbers of Al-Qaeda and others who are believed to be in Pakistan?
Well, no one really seems to know how many al-Qaeda have come across into Pakistan from Afghanistan since the fall of the Taliban, or indeed how many were here already. But it does seem there are credible reports that they have come across into the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan, where they do have pockets of support. Pakistan has deployed its troops for the first time in that area and says they're working effectively, but it's a very long, porous border. And the fact that we have seen these attacks on foreigners has left many, including the French government, to suggest al-Qaeda may well have been behind them.
Susanna, thank you. And there's been another suicide bombing tonight in Israel, this time in a shopping centre. 3 people are believed dead, including the bomber, and 30 injured. The bomb went off this evening in a pedestrian area in the town of Rishon LeZion on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. It's the same town that was hit by a suicide bomb 2 weeks ago.
Scared and in shock, but alive, a survivor carried to safety after another night of panic and carnage, another suicide bombing. The second time for this town to suffer in just 2 weeks. The previous suicide bomber killed 16 people here as they played pool. The target tonight, a crowded pedestrian mall full of outdoor cafes. Israelis had been starting to relax, starting to go back out on their own streets. The army's recent assault on the West Bank was supposed to stop the bombers. Instead, 3 suicide attacks since Sunday. The fear is back. Israel isn't expected to make a massive military response, though senior officials keeping their options open tonight.
Israel will have to continue to defend itself, to defend its citizens. This is what the Israeli people are expecting from its government. Before we start to negotiate peace, we need calm and quiet on our streets. We need to be our people to be able to go to shopping malls, our children to go to schools, and our teenagers to go to discotheques.
But that's a world away tonight as more wounded are filling the hospitals, more casualties of a war that has no front lines. Tonight's bombing came just hours after Israel hunted down and killed a leading Palestinian militant, together with 2 of his associates. An innocent bystander was also reported killed in that attack. This has been a day of bloodshed on both sides, and both sides are now expecting worse to come. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Radical changes to Britain's drug laws are being considered by the government tonight. A committee of MPs has called for a big shift in policy from punishment to education and treatment. Their report says the top priority must be tackling the most dangerous drugs, heroin and cocaine. Among their key proposals, heroin should be more widely available on prescription, along with safe injecting areas. Ecstasy should be downgraded to a Class B drug. That's been flatly rejected by the government. Cannabis should be downgraded to Class C. Possession would no longer lead to arrest. And the law should distinguish between social dealing and selling drugs for profit. Margaret Gilmore has been to County Durham, where hard drug use is rising fast.
A decade ago, drugs wasn't a problem in County Durham. Today, there are 2,000 or 3,000 injecting addicts. Dealers moved in the 90s. The price of heroin went down as the amount being smuggled in went up. It wasn't hard today to find the paraphernalia. It was when the dealers first arrived that 36-year-old Paul Duffy started taking heroin. He believes he could have been weaned off it if he'd been prescribed diamorphine, the clinical term for heroin, rather than buying it illegally.
If they can be prescribed diamorphine, they haven't got that bother of trying to fund it themselves, and it's clean heroin. The quicker they prescribe diamorphine, the quicker they'll get this heroin problem sorted.
Yeah, so the burns are sort of healing up very nicely, aren't they?
Tom Carnworth works in Durham and is one of only 40 doctors in the UK allowed to prescribe diamorphine. Today's report says there should be more, a new trial so doctors actually supervise addicts as they inject it, which could be several times a day. He's not convinced.
I think it is bad because I think the main point of drug treatment is to get people to lead normal lives. If they're coming in 3 times a day to a centre and all their life is revolving around their addiction, that's not good news.
The report wants more treatment for users instead of jailing the thousands who steal to get cash to feed their habit. This report marks a huge change in emphasis, a move away from punishment, much more towards helping people on drugs. Many of the ideas are far too radical for the government at the moment, but it could prove the blueprint for how future generations deal with drugs. On this estate, CCTV targets dealers and users. The man coordinating all drugs treatment in Durham agrees with the message of today's report.
We need to see free access to treatment without necessarily the prerequisite of having committed a crime. And I think we need a policy that looks at how we selectively treat people, commensurate with their need.
Cocaine, ecstasy.
Detective Chief Inspector Denny Pygel says of all the drugs police seize, the amount of heroin here has doubled in the past year.
Cannabis. £10 would buy you a £10 bag of heroin. As a user, I would need at least 2 to 5 bags a day.
Can they afford it?
They can't afford it. A lot commit crime to get it.
The report says efforts to track dealers who supply hard drugs should be redoubled. There's also a get real message accepting that many young people like these tonight use drugs like cannabis socially. Critics say the committee is sending confusing signals. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News, Durham.
And our social affairs editor Neil Dixon is at the Home Office now. Neil, a report as radical as this must terrify any government. It's just not going to buy into it, is it?
Well, they've made it abundantly clear they're not going to do one thing, and that's downgrade ecstasy. They regard ecstasy as dangerous, they regard it as unpredictable, and it can be a killer. And this is a government that, it still wants to appear tough on crime. Their problem is they're 5 years into office. They came in with a drug czar, with drug action teams, lots of targets, and they frankly don't have a great deal to show for it. They broadly continued Conservative policy over the first 5 years. They're now trying to find if they can do something different, and at the moment there are still, in their view, too many young people taking drugs and too much drug-related crime.
Well, if ministers are being wary tonight about their responses, what's your betting on the direction they will now take?
Well, I think we will see more treatment and more emphasis on treatment than punishment. Though I think you shouldn't be fooled into thinking that treatment is an easy option. Just ask anybody who's had to go through it and wean themselves off heroin. It's a tough and difficult process. But the report today described current treatment services as woefully inadequate. So I think there will be more of that. There will be more emphasis, as we've seen this week, on prevention in schools and trying to get a message to young people not to take up drugs in the first place. And there will be a relaxation of cannabis laws. Now, of course, the difficulty there is the government sending a mixed message? There's already some evidence that some young people think cannabis is legal already. And of course it's not, and it's not proposed that it should be. So getting that more sophisticated message across will be the big challenge that they'll face.
Neil Dixon, thank you. Thousands of protesters have greeted President Bush on his arrival in Germany for the start of a European tour. Demonstrators gathered in Berlin to protest against US policies on Iraq and other issues. Mr. Bush is due to address the German Parliament before going on to Russia, France and Italy to drum up support for his war on global terror.
There was a warm welcome from Chancellor Schröder tonight, followed by crayfish and salad in a top Berlin restaurant. But for all the pleasantries, this is the start of a tough European tour. Mr. Bush wants to heal a widening transatlantic rift. The Americans are fed up with what they see as constant carping by Europeans about American policies.
America bashing is now in fashion in a way that it hasn't been since Vietnam. That was not the case before September the 11th. Before September the 11th, there was disagreement, but it was much more polite than it has been lately.
Berlin's anti-terrorist units have checked every nook and cranny for bombs, but there's nothing to protect Mr. Bush from political attacks. European politicians struggle to put a positive gloss on the growing divide.
And it is true that now we have several points in which we have profound disagreements, but we try to overcome them, and that should not mean that we are at odds in everything.
In his speech at the Bundestag tomorrow, George Bush will be upbeat about it all. But the fact is, the US-European relationship is at its lowest point in 2 decades.
There are open disagreements over President Bush's decisions to pull out of treaties on global warming and the planned International Criminal Court. Europe is dismayed by new American trade barriers, and support for the war on terror is dwindling, especially since Mr. Bush shifted his focus towards a possible attack on Iraq.
Tonight, thousands of anti-war protesters made their feelings known in the streets of Berlin. Only 19% of Germans say they have a positive view of Mr. Bush. But it's the more subtle, behind-the-scenes pressure at his meetings with politicians that will concern the president most. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Berlin.
Railtrack may still face criminal charges over the Paddington rail crash. The Crown Prosecution Service has asked police to investigate the management of Signal 109, which was passed at red by one of the trains involved in the tragedy. 31 people died in 1999 when a Thames train service collided with a Great Western Express at Ladbroke Grove. A ban on women soldiers serving in frontline combat roles is to remain in place. The Defence Secretary Geoff Hoon said today he was not prepared to risk the combat effectiveness of the armed forces. The announcement follows a 2-year review of the bar on women serving in infantry and tank crews. England's World Cup hopes were dealt another blow today when Danny Murphy joined the injury list. The Liverpool midfielder hurt his left foot during training. David Eads is with the England squad in South Korea. David.
Peter, I can tell you that Danny Murphy is on crutches. His left foot is heavily bandaged. He must cut a pretty sorry figure in the team hotel behind us here. We're told that he fell awkwardly on his foot just at the end of training and obviously a big problem for England. What the medical team now have to do is ascertain whether anything's actually broken.
Sven only drafted him in because of other players' injuries, but now Danny Murphy has joined the casualty list, which is threatening to sabotage England's World Cup campaign. To make matters worse, Murphy was one of the few players to shine in the warm-up against South Korea. Having got here, he was beginning to stake his claim, but now he's part of a mounting problem. It looks like a midfield curse on England. It was just before the squad set off that Steven Gerrard was ruled out. Murphy replaced him, but now he's doubtful. And critically, the trio of Nicky Butt, the Newcastle midfielder Kieran Dyer and England skipper David Beckham are still not fit. So is it time for Sven to contemplate taking on the world's best without those last 3 names?
I never thought about that, and I refuse to think about it. It should be very, very bad luck. And no, they will win. At least 2 of 3.
And one of them has to be Beckham. His left leg is still strapped up, but he's using it again, however tentatively. Today, his coach described him as the best right-footed player in the world, one of the best midfielders in the world. It's difficult to exaggerate his importance to this squad. One England player who is fit still left the squad this morning, supposedly surplus to requirements. Trevor Sinclair had an 8,000-mile journey home. Now he may have to turn right round and come back again.
You know, fingers crossed for the lads that are injured. You know, hopefully they can make full recovery. But if they don't, I'm waiting by the phone, and you know, I'll be ready to come back out at the drop of a hat.
And if England's problems are as bad as they seem, that call could come as soon as Friday.
So I think he could be clocking up a few air miles before this adventure is over. Not that England are the only side with problems. The French may have to do without Thierry Henry, for example. Freddie Ljungberg of Sweden is also a doubt. And the Irish captain, Roy Keane, almost walked out of the squad altogether because of a rift in their camp. Having said that, here on the island of Jeju, there is a feeling within the England camp that things, just at the moment, are conspiring against them. Back to you, Peter.
David, thank you. The government's chief scientist has told the 10 o'clock news that funding will be found for a new laboratory in Cambridge researching neural diseases. The local authority said it couldn't afford security for the centre, which will use monkeys for testing. The importance of science will be highlighted in a major speech by the Prime Minister tomorrow, and he'll criticise animal rights protesters for blocking scientific advances.
It doesn't look like fertile ground for the world's top lab studying brain disorders. But this site is where they hope to build a centre to find treatments for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease.
But to achieve those breakthroughs for human health, those cures, the scientists say they would have to experiment on animals. Not farm animals like these, but macaques or marmosets. Primates' brains are most similar to those of human beings.
A price worth paying for John Ardley, who has Parkinson's, here looking over the site with his opponent, animal rights campaigner Joan Court.
They will be mutilating primates
They will be injecting chemicals into their brains. They will be subjecting them to total life imprisonment.
I think in the end, if you don't use primates, you've got to use human beings as guinea pigs for these trials. And I think of the two, I think animals would be better used than human beings. I don't think you can risk another thalidomide case, for example, where a drug isn't properly tested and then found to be harmful to humans.
But it's not reasoned argument which is holding up the plans.
You filthy, spineless cowards.
But the fear of lawlessness. These demonstrations just down the road at the well-known animal testing centre, Huntingdon Life Sciences, frequently became violent. The director was beaten up. Controlling the protests and protecting the workers cost millions. Faced with a potential new focus for unrest, the police warned of more attacks, traffic gridlock and diverting officers from other work. So the local planning authority said no. The government saw this as intimidation blocking scientific progress and has now promised to meet the policing cost.
It would clearly be unacceptable if the country was unable to put up a laboratory of this importance in the Cambridge area. And if it was unable to do this, it would also be seen to be a victory by the animal rights extremists.
This is Tony Blair's view of the future industrial landscape of Britain. Science parks like this in Cambridge now employ over 50,000 people. So he cares about science not just because it contributes to the health of the people, but more crucially, he believes it will be the foundation for the wealth of the nation. Tom Heap, BBC News in Cambridge.
An Oxfordshire mother who was jailed for letting her children play truant was released early today after her sentence was reduced on appeal. Patricia Amos had her 60-day sentence cut in half at Oxford Crown Court. But the judge insisted she had been rightly jailed as she had persistently neglected her parental duties. Our education correspondent Mike Baker was in court.
After almost a fortnight in prison, Patricia Amos walked free tonight, but only after being told by the judge she deserved to be punished for allowing her children's education to suffer.
Obviously, Mrs. Amos is delighted to be out. She's very grateful for all the interest and the support that she's received over the last 2 weeks. And all she really wants to do now is to get home to see the children again.
Earlier, Mrs. Amos listened as the court heard how her teenage daughters had repeatedly missed school while she had breached parenting orders. The judge told Patricia Amos that she was responsible for her children's education, but that she had simply not bothered to send them to school. He said, therefore, it had been right to impose a prison sentence, particularly as all other measures had been tried and had failed. But he concluded that, taking into account her personal circumstances, in particular the devastation she had felt at the loss of her mother some 3 years ago, the prison sentence had been unnecessarily long. The Education Authority, which brought the original case, was pleased the principle had been upheld and that a warning had been sent to other parents who condoned truancy.
The judge was supportive. He told us we'd taken the right action. I hope this will be a warning that we mean business. Truancy is not acceptable. Children need their education and they only have one chance.
Patricia Amos's daughters are now back at school. With 50,000 children truanting each day, ministers hope the threat of prison will get other parents to take action. Mike Baker, BBC News, Oxford.
Rock stars lined up with classical actors, composers and film directors tonight to pay tribute to the Queen. Hundreds of stars, including the artist David Hockney, Dame Vera Lynn and Lord Attenborough, gathered at the Royal Academy in London. The Queen was presenting 5 Golden Jubilee Awards to support new talent. Rosie Millard was there.
Wave to the handsome one. Dame Shirley Bassey was one of the first to arrive for a night which boasted nearly 1,000 stars. They came from across the arts world to see the Queen declaring the Royal Academy's new Annenberg courtyard open. After she had given out her £10,000 Jubilee Awards, the party began.
We all like to schmooze with the royals occasionally, and also it makes you feel, I suppose, that the arts are still considered to be an important part of our culture today, which indeed they still are. I mean, it's one of the few things we do still appear to manage to do reasonably well.
And then there's the pop star's perspective.
The last time I thought of the Queen in terms of a Jubilee celebration was at the time of God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols in 1977, and here we are again, and here I've just shaken hands with her. So, you know, the world works in funny ways.
Show business people are always ready to go to a do.
aren't they? I get asked to do all sorts of things. And if they think it's something to do with royalty and the arts, they're there.
So was the Queen familiar with every celebrated name on the guest list? Possibly not, but that didn't matter.
I got to meet a lot of good friends who the Queen had no idea who they were, even though they're famous around the world. But she came, we smiled, we bowed, we were respectful to somebody who represented something bigger than all of us.
Of course, arts people need no excuse to enjoy a party, but there's no question that tonight they've really relished the attention shown to them by the Queen and Prince Philip. Rosie Millard, BBC News at the Royal Academy of Arts.
And it's just gone 10:25. I'll be back a little later with an update on the day's headlines, but now we join our news teams across the United Kingdom.
Good evening. A missionary from Brighton has gone missing during a civil war in the West African state of Liberia. Father Gary Jenkins was last seen 9 days ago working near the capital Monrovia when it was overrun by rebels. It's now feared that he's been captured. John Young reports.
Father Gary Jenkins is everything you'd expect a missionary to be. Last year he baptised about 1,200 people. He'd spent the last 30 years in Liberia. At best a volatile country, a civil war there broke out 7 years ago. A dangerous place for a missionary to be.
On Saturday last, the government soldiers were about to retake Tubmanburg in Bommy Hills. It had been overrun by the Lord rebel organisation. That is the place where Father Gary was assigned, and he was at his mission there. Now, the last reported sightings were of him there at the mission. But we have heard, but again it's unconfirmed, that he has been removed from that area and taken to the rebel headquarters in Vonjima in the very north of the country.
At the church in Brighton, which he visits each year, prayers are being said tonight.
One occasion he came back just after the massacre of some religious sisters on his mission, and the time he came back just before Easter, and he'd had to be flat on the ground with bullets flying over his head. Not an easy mission field to be in, and so I'm full of admiration for him as a man of great determination and courage.
The Foreign Office said tonight it was investigating what has happened to Father Jenkins. His church and friends are keeping close contact.
John Young reporting. A 22-year-old man from Sussex who's alleged to be having a relationship with a 12-year-old girl was today banned from contacting the child. The order was made when Luke Salmon from South Chailey appeared at Lewis Crown Court to face charges of assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest. Mr. Salmon was released on bail to stand trial in July. Murder Squad detectives have arrested a man after the body of a woman was discovered in Eastbourne. Her body was found at a house in Friday Street, Langley, yesterday evening. She's been identified as Saffron Coleman, who was 21. A post-mortem this afternoon revealed she'd been strangled. Police are questioning a man in his 20s. Britain's biggest rail freight operator, EWS, went to the European Parliament today to try to make the French government improve security on its side of the Channel Tunnel. The company is arguing that France is breaking European law by failing to prevent asylum seekers from the Sangatte refugee camp near Calais boarding its trains bound for the UK. Chris Morris reports from Brussels.
One train that did get in on time. Representatives of Britain's biggest rail freight operator, EWS, arrive in Brussels. They came to tell the European Parliament that they believe France is breaking European law by failing to provide a secure environment at the entrance to the Channel Tunnel.
All EWS is seeking is proper security around the railway yard near Calais, a decent fence and decent round-the-clock policing, so that the asylum seekers don't see this as the easy option for getting into the United Kingdom. If we get that, then the asylum seekers will have to look elsewhere. It's for others to deal with immigration policy in the Sangatte camp. We just want to run freight trains.
Every day and every night, asylum seekers desperate to get to Britain play a game of cat and mouse with the French police. The police are overwhelmed, and the chaos here has led to the cancellation of more than 2,600 trains in the last 6 months. EWS has been losing £500,000 a week, and it says France should be held responsible under the law for failing to ensure the free movement of goods in Europe. This is all about EWS putting as much political pressure as possible on the French authorities. There's a general election in France next month, and the company wants security at the Channel Tunnel to be a top priority once the new government takes office.
Chris Morris reporting from Brussels. A man who stole 29 metric road signs in Kent and daubed paint on others has been found guilty of theft and criminal damage. Tony Bennett, who's 54 and from Essex, stole the signs in Tenterden. He's a member of the UK Independence Party, and the judge at Maidstone Magistrates Court described him as an imperial vigilante. He said that Bennett had no authority to remove the signs and ordered him to carry out 50 hours community service. A 13-year-old boy from Whitstable was released from hospital today after being shot in the eye with an air pistol. He was hit while in his school playground at Whitstable Community College last Friday. On Monday this week, 2 girls were shot in the arm and leg as they walked down a road in Canterbury. Police are now trying to impress on youngsters that air weapons are not toys. Ramblers have won a court battle to keep open a footpath on the famous White Cliffs between Dover and Folkestone. The County Council had shut it, saying that it was unnecessary and difficult to maintain. Simon Jones has the story.
This is the path in Capel the Ramblers call their little gem, and it's easy to see why. Kent County Council, though, took a different view. They said it was dangerous to maintain and got an order to shut it from Dover magistrates. But the campaigners went to the Crown Court and got that ruling overturned.
I love cliff top walks, so I came to retiring Capel for that very purpose. I wanted to be near the cliffs for walks. I wanted to walk in the place where I grew up in the Warren, and it was sad to see this particular path, which is quite an impressive one. It was sad to see it disappear.
But disappear it nearly did as it became overgrown, until the Ramblers took it on themselves last year to clear it, effectively disproving, according to the judge, the council's argument it was too dangerous to look after.
And finally, a look at the weather for Kent and Sussex. Tonight will be dry and clear, temperatures down to 8 Celsius. Tomorrow should see plenty of sunshine, but also some heavy showers, temperatures up to 18 Celsius. That's it. Good night. Headlines are next.
And the main news tonight. British citizens have been advised to leave Pakistan amid terrorist threats. Half our diplomats there have been pulled out. The Kashmir crisis has deepened. India's Prime Minister told his troops it's time for a decisive fight. There's been another suicide bombing in Israel. 3 are dead and 30 hurt. And here, an MP's report says government drugs policy has failed and calls for fundamental changes. Newsnight starting now, over on BBC Two, but from us all on the 10 o'clock news. Good night.
Hello there, good evening. We've had low pressure on our doorstep today, and that's brought plenty of showers and really squally winds as well. But this low behind me, well, I think this could well be more important. It's a developing low crossing the Atlantic and heading towards us, and this is set to bring yet more wet weather and, more importantly, some very windy weather as well. It starts to move in during tomorrow night, and then it gradually crosses us through the course of Friday and also into the weekend. It's going to bring with it gales or possibly severe gales. We really are going to have to keep a close eye on that one. Anyway, out there at the moment, while the showers are fading away quite nicely from eastern areas, not too chilly a night, thankfully. In the west, there's still quite a lot of cloud around. The showers easing in intensity, but I think they will get going again later in the night and through the morning. Some heavy showers for many western parts of the UK. Eastern areas doing okay, some pleasant sunshine to wake up to, but here too the cloud will build up and there'll be some fairly beefy showers developing from, say, late morning onwards, and again, hail and thunder thrown in. Mind you, later in the day in the west, things should quieten down a little bit. A more pleasant end to the day here, I think. A little bit of a lull with some pleasant sunshine. And as a result, feeling quite nice out there with highs of, say, 16 or 17 for Northern Ireland, around 18 for Lossiemouth perhaps, and 18 or 19 for the Midlands and the South East. That's around the mid-60s. Then things change dramatically later tomorrow and during Friday, as I said. Now, the Met Office has a weather watch on this because we're quite concerned about the strength of the wind. As I said, as well as the wet weather, the winds are going to be a feature. England and Wales most at risk, and we could well be talking about gusts to 60 miles an hour, possibly a little higher in places and even in inland areas. So that's a worry. As you can see, a very nasty day for Friday if you're travelling. Thus, the rain clears up into Scotland. There'll be a lot of squally showers around. Hail and thunder, those strong gale force winds. I'm not going to be feeling very warm either. And still some windy weather if you're travelling through Friday night and into Saturday. That low slow to ease away. But eventually it will do, and the winds will start to ease just a little bit more as we go through the course of the weekend. Low pressure, though, still means a lot of showers. So after such a dramatic end to the week with all those showers and that very windy weather, the weekend does look as though those winds will slowly ease down, but there'll still be some rather lengthy downpours. So if you have got plans for the weekend, some of you may escape the rain and see some sunshine, but basically expect the rain. It's going to take a long time for the weather to settle down next week. That's it for now. Bye-bye.
The wait is over to decide the best team in Europe. English champions, the Leicester Tigers, take on Ireland's top team Munster in the European Rugby Cup final for club and country. Can Munster cage the Leicester Tigers, hungry to conquer Europe? The European Rugby Cup final, live on Saturday from 2:30 on BBC One.
Now on BBC One, tonight's National Lottery results. In the Lotto draw, the 6 winning numbers are confirmed as 5, 9, 18, 39, 43 and 46, and the bonus number is 48. Early indications show that there is one lucky jackpot winner, winning just over £3.3 million. The winning numbers in the Lotto Extra draw are 3, 17, 18, 37, 44 and 46. Early indications show that there are no winners tonight, which means the jackpot for the next draw has grown to an estimated £14 million.
Listen, I've been called back to the office. Coming with one of the main relay circuits, so I need to go and fix it.
Matthew, it's your birthday.
Get inside.
No longer will we suffer in silence.
The war against terrorism.
The biggest threat to national security in years.
Who do you work for?
Her Majesty's Secret Service.
You fixed it then?
Kind of. Spooks, Monday at 9, only on BBC One. MI5, not 9 to 5.
Altering the future now on BBC One, Jean-Claude Van Damme is an elite agent policing the violent time travel highways with strong language. Time Cop.